So my name is Irina Overeem. I'm a river and coastal processes sedimentary engineer, geologist kind of mixture. I came to permafrost through coastal erosion and have since moved a little bit more landward and work on rivers and coasts and permafrost, in permafrost terrain as well. And so what I was invited to talk about today is this project that we've been running over the last few years, which is a collaboration with Elchin Yafarov and Kevin Schaefer, and then the people that work actively on it, Kang Wang and Lei Teng, who are a postdoc and a student here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And so what we're working on is to develop a toolbox of numerical models that can be used to simulate permafrost and combine it with like landscape response models, like sometimes simple models, sometimes a bit more complex models. This was a project funded by the National Science Foundation under their cyber infrastructure program that was active at the time. And so it's a little bit more focused on cyber infrastructure and the building of these tools. But I'll share like some of the science that we're trying to do with it too, so that you have an idea of like what kind of questions we're asking. And then I should also introduce that the place I work at the University of Colorado is the Community Service Dynamics Modeling System. And so we're building some of the tools using infrastructure that was there through like that larger process modeling cyber infrastructure. So just to answer the sort of the whys and the whats of the reasons why we do this, I think I'm preaching a little bit to the choir because it sounds like all of you work in permafrost, but it's rapidly warming. It's one of the places, the north is one of the places where things are changing the most quickly, and thus we expect that this warming would also trigger changes in landscape processes. And that can be in hill slopes, it can be like debris flows running over roads, it can be landslides, it can be eroding coasts. And so there's relevance to each of these domains in the surface processes of permafrost melt. And then the other motivating reason is why we want to understand permafrost and why we want to like couple these models is that the landscape change may be relevant also for new carbon that has always been frozen or has like been frozen for a long time, that potentially is being released when permafrost thaws. And the way my group is thinking about this is also about like, how does it get transported once it is released? Does it then get sequestered at places in the landscape again? And so those are sort of the motivating reasons of why we do this exploratory modeling. Modeling in general, we do it because if you want to make predictions of future conditions, then you can't observe, right? So you need observations first to understand mechanisms. But then to make predictions, you'd have to use models. And so that's why this like endeavors to like make models is still the thing that we do. Specifically the permafrost modeling toolbox. So the toolbox that we're developing is open source. So it's available on this platform for open source code to share that's called GitHub. And the address is like in different places in my presentation. And it's there for everyone to use. Like we encourage people to either use it and like report back or to like collaborate and find like weird connections that you want to make, because definitely in my small biased view, I only look at some connections between permafrost and landscapes. So initially the vision for this toolbox was that for different reasons and different science questions, you need different levels of complexity of models. For some questions, you could even maybe just answer the question with knowing whether permafrost is there or not. And you could use a very simple model of what is the annual temperature distribution for an area. And so those were maybe the most simple models that you could imagine about permafrost. And then you can like kind of step up the complexity and have layered models that do a thermal balance. You can have numerical models that some of you build and are very familiar with. And so each of those can be used for different questions and different purposes, some for teaching only, and that's a relevant part too. So we wanted to make available these different levels of complexity models, maybe not the very most advanced models. That's sort of the domain of big science being done at national labs, or this is more at the level of a grad student wants to couple together different processes, or a policymaker wants to look at a certain region. What are the permafrost conditions, or what's the regime? And then the other thing that I'll point out here is that we're specifically interested in these connections between what does the permafrost model do, and then what does the geomorphology or the coastal processes, what do they do? The other thing we recognized is that any single model like needs some inputs, right? It may be just annual temperature in a very simple case, or it may be like much more complex parameters of the soil, or the precipitation, the meteorology, etc., etc. And so you want to allow for inputs to like be relatively easy to connect to the system. So we built this cyber infrastructure around this. The way we're mostly using this right now is through like Python and a set of like Jupyter notebooks, which is sort of an easy high-level language, programming language, and with notebooks being like sort of example sheets, people can kind of quickly pick up models and run them for themselves, but then add their own data sets or work with them. There's also a web interface, which is maybe a bit more for teaching, where you can just use a graphical user interface with the tool. One of the core things we do is we develop the models that we grab as components. And so that means that they stay their original model that's maybe been tested and validated by the community already, but they get wrapped with this basic model interface is what it's called. And that makes it more easy to call out what kind of parameters a model needs and what kind of parameters a model sets. So imagine a model needs snow to predict permafrost temperature, then that will be in the specification in that model interface. It needs snow thickness, for example. And so the models have that in their input files normally, but this like calls that out at the outside of things. So what kind of models are available? Well, like I talked about very simple models. Like one of the very simple models we use is the air frost number model, which is, I think, mostly for teaching. And you can ingest an annual temperature approximation and say whether permafrost is likely to be present or not present. There is a version of the Kudryavtsev model, which is a layered model. It's still like fairly empirical and allows for vegetation and snow and like calculates the thermal change between those layers and then propagates thermal, an annual cycle through in the soil as well. There's a model that connects to this that sets the snow conditions. That's called, it comes from Environment Canada. That's why it's EC Simple Snow. So there's a simple snow model. And all of these can run in a column or one point. So 1D is what I call that. Or they can do this as a map. And it's still, the map is a map of all these points together. So there's no like 2D connections between different points. They're all like vertical columns, but they're next to each other. And they're all different potentially. Then the third model, and this is Vlad's model and Elshin's model, is the GIPL model. That's from the Geophysical Institute of the Permafrost Lab model. And we used this is a Fortran model. And so we've built a wrapper around that with Python. And so it's just become available through this system as well. Like literally like yesterday was when it got submitted. And the other one that we're working on is this river temperature model that I'd been working on with a student to connect to permafrost. And then Gary Clow wrote this model in MATLAB that's called the continuum volume model. It's really well documented and it got published. It might take longer to become part of this Perma Toolbox. It's there in the repository and available for people, but it's not connectable because it's in MATLAB and needs to be translated before we can use it. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, we share these through the Python toolkit, which is the overarching toolkit that CSDMS builds. And then each model is kept there and instantiated, and like a person can like download the PyMT, which is this is called, and then can import these models. So like, for example, we shortened Kudryavtsev model here to Q model, and you do like import PyMT models, and then Q is the model that you would be using in this case. And so these go with like little educational labs so that people get a quick start with them, and then you can like make connections or follow tutorials to make changes in snow or vegetation or changes in soil, etc. Any of these are like available from this GitHub site, and there is documentation with each of them for basic runs. Are there questions so far, or? Okay. So I'm gonna highlight a little bit the Kudryavtsev model, just because it is at, it seems like sort of to be at the right level of complexity to combine with a lot of like longer term landscape evolution models or coastal models, or like we were combining it with the deltaic model. Because what it tells you is based on meteorological conditions, on snow cover conditions, and on vegetation, and the temperature, of course, what would be like active layer thicknesses and what would be the depth of thaw for every single year. And you can imagine that for terrestrial processes or for sediment transport process, that matters, right? You have like a different layer of available sediment that you could either erode into or you could transport, etc. So like we've been using this as like sort of our toy model to combine with landscape evolution models or deltaic models. And so people who do more advanced physics, they will recognize that this is really a big simplification. But on the other hand, there are like quite a bit of like sort of the core processes that control permafrost temperature are incorporated in there, right? Snow is there, surface vegetation as a buffering or insulating effect can be there. And then you can set all kinds of properties for the soil parameters. So it allows for quite a bit of experimentation.
Irina?
Yes.
Just very small comment.
Yeah.
To the previous slide. Actually, this slide is from Sergei Marchenko, and it was published in this, I think it was a book, what Anisimov was the lead.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Maybe we should change to, because it's Sergei's graphing, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think Elchin gave it to me.
All right, well, you can ask Elchin to find some appropriate,
the proper reference for it.
Yeah, to Sergei, because it's his diagram. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That's good, because we're like just writing up the, I mean, not like the theory of this model necessarily, right? That comes from like those papers, but more like how we implemented the wrapper around it and like what we've done with like sensitivity testing. So it's good to get the appropriate references for that lined up. Thank you. So I'm gonna show you one example of like hooking up these different elements of like a toolbox and like sort of like what we can do with it or how we think about landscape processes then. So I'm gonna look at something on like a river basin scale. So like imagine like a hydrological unit for like a whole river. Like it starts in the mountains and it goes like all the way to the coast and forms a delta there. And so if you sort of conceptualize that, and like sedimentary people do this all the time, right? They will like think about this as a source to sink problem, where the source is maybe in the mountains because their transport is fast and glaciers can erode sediment quickly. Then you have like hill slopes and alpine relief, and then you get into maybe the North Slope and it's like flat and lakes, etc. And there's sort of different places in the landscape. And then you get into the ocean where like sediment settles quickly and gets sequestered again. And so we challenged ourselves to think about not just sediment, but also about the particular organic carbon and like where does that come from in this landscape and where does it get sequestered. And so, and then you can paint a permafrost layer over this, right? It will be different when you're in a permafrost landscape than when you're in some mid-latitude. So we hypothesized that the coastal plains or like sort of the river corridors are the sort of the sources of carbon more so, and then the sediment may come more from like the higher parts of the landscape. And so overarching research questions that you can ask then is like, what are the mechanisms for delivery and transport? Like, where does the sediment stay? Where is it stored? And then visualize this as like a conveyor belt where things like truck through the landscape with processes. We particularly think about this for the Brooks Range. This is more in a proposal state than that it's like finished or so, but sort of the first runs of the models are done in this way. And we also try to think about carbon and not just about sedimentation or landscape processes. So one application is for river basins in the National Arctic Wildlife Refuge. And that is a nice self-contained river basin or like a set of river basins with very high peaks, and then the coastal plains very flat, and then small deltas at the coast of the Beaufort Sea. And so what I'll show you today is like runs with the GIPL model that we did for these three river basins. And so in the way of thinking about the Permafrost Toolbox, what we're combining is this data sets in pink. So meteorological data or climate model output data, whether you're in the past or in the future. We need soil types. Potentially we need soil carbon from the Permafrost Carbon Network database. We need to drive a layer of snow, put that on top of the GIPL model. And then the things that we predict are temperature of the permafrost, active layer thickness. And if you combine with soil carbon, you can say something about possible carbon release, or at least like sort of like how much of the reservoir you're accessing over time. Right? So like these elements, the models, the input, and then these are sort of the outputs that we look at. So this will sound familiar to some of you. We use data sets that have been developed and especially downscaled for Alaska. So that sets the climate over the last century, or we use community climate model results to set climate over the next century or our century. And variables that we pull out of that are like precipitation and air temperature. The runs are at monthly resolution, but they're like fairly high spatial resolution. So that means we have a lot of pixels for these three river basins. There's also a couple of parameters that are not changing over time. They're sort of like from the beginning, this is what we stick with. And that's like a snow classification map, a land cover map, and then this soil grit database and a carbon density database. That gives you an idea of what kind of carbon is in the soils and what kind of soil physical parameters and thermal properties you have And so these are a little coarser resolution than, but fairly comparable with the other ones. Especially this is like a really new database, so it's kind of a novel thing to run at that density with so much information. Not to be trusted per se, but at least it comes from the soil maps that are available for these areas. I'm going to skip through this one. We did like some validation runs. So maybe I should show you quickly here the historical data. So this is mean annual ground temperature for every year from like the 20s is where we're looking now. And you can see like soil temperatures are still like pretty low. And they vary year to year. There's cold years, there's warm years. And then I think you probably noticed like the color scale like changing already to like lighter blue. So we're getting more over the century, more into this like higher temperatures. That gets a lot more dramatic when you run this with a fairly extreme climate scenario. So this is the RCP, the representative concentration pathway 8.5. And you can see like how quickly soil temperatures are warming when you drive it with this kind of a climate scenario. Cool. I'll show you the more extreme run for the active layer thickness into the future, just to sort of keep the conversation going a little bit. And what we see here is that actually active layer thicknesses are like rapidly changing, and more dramatically so in the areas that are higher up in the landscape. And it kind of surprises that in the beginning. At first, I thought this was a temperature signal, where in the mountains, like things warm up quicker. And so we looked into that, but then, oh, sorry. When you look at this graph here, this is the mean annual temperature trend over that century, and it's binned per elevation class. And so you see that there's actually not that much difference in this downscale or in this climate run between the different elevations. A slight little bit, but like maybe not as significant. If you look at the active layer trend per elevation class, you can see that there is a peak in the landscape where most change is happening. So this is the trend over the full 100 years. And so most of this active layer deepening seems to be happening out of this model setup and with all its like uncertainties in like sort of the foothills, like maybe between 700 and 1700 meters. I see Vlad nodding. That's a good sign, right?
Except that the kind of theoretical question, if you can still call it active layer.
Yes, I know.
It may be already degrading permafrost and developing a phthalic. And by definition of the active layer, in this case, it will be seasonally frozen layer, which will be much shallower and actually getting shallower and shallower this time. I mean, thinner and thinner. So, in terms of terminology, yeah, you have to be careful here because it may be already phthalic development, not just active layer.
Right. Yeah, and especially, I mean, because the pixels are so large, like we're looking at 700 by 700 meter, like sort of the micro relief of things where like you're in the floodplain and you get like a deeper phthalic, or you're under a riverbed and you like already had a phthalic and it's really deepening fast. That's really not in this model necessarily, right? Because there is no like hydrology on the landscape in a way. But yes, thank you.
What I'm saying that in the mountains, 3 meters active layer, it's common thing. I mean, it will freeze or temperature get below zero for all of this area. It could be even 5 meters, but on farther on the Arctic plain, 3 meters of thaw, it means that during the next winter it will not freeze completely. We cannot freeze 3 meters in the warmer climate.
Right.
Maybe now, kind of barely you can, but end of century with this warmer climate, you cannot freeze 3 meters. So in this case, your seasonally frozen layer will not meet the top of permafrost.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in this case, this is kind of theoretical discussion, but you cannot call this 3 meters active layer because it's not freezing in the winter completely.
I see. Because you mean like, but it's transient, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's terminology, but active layer supposed to thaw during the summer and completely freeze during the winter. And it will be only upper part of your layer which will freeze in the winter, but say somewhere between 2.5 meters and 3 meters, it will be not frozen during the winter. And you can see it from the results of your model.
Yep.
I understand that you choose to report.
Yeah, it's like the deepest thaw depth, basically. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the other thing that that this kind of drove home to us was like, so it's not like I'm bidding still with elevation, right? And I'm showing that like the active layer trend is like maybe the most deepening happening in these like foothills regions. And so we were trying to explain why and go back to the physics here. And so like one of the big causes of that is the volumetric water content that we have in these soils when you're in a more well-drained mountainous setting versus completely saturated water, logged north slope conditions where like things are flat and you already have a lot of standing water. And so some of this deepening of the thaw front that's predicted has to do with this like volumetric water content changing in those regions or like more significantly. And then snow depth trend is a little bit of a part of the story, not so much the annual temperature cycle. In contrast, and I think this doesn't come as a real surprise, I think we kind of knew that, is where does the carbon come from? And then you like look back into the database of where we think the carbon is from soil samples. And we know that in the lower regions, the soils are more carbon rich, right? So you get this like interaction of where's a lot of carbon available versus where there's a lot of thaw front deepening. And those two factors like play with each other. So that the most carbon still released in the lower regions of the system, just because you start with more carbon in the soils there. And to bring those two things together a bit, like what we do here is we initialize everything and we multiply like active layer thickening times the carbon available in a grid cell like that from like Gustav's database. And so you'll see that like here you have the initial pattern of what people think that carbon is already where it is in the landscape, and like that's part of the geology and sort of quaternary history of it. But then you get this change on top of it and release of carbon over time. And you can see how quickly it speeds up in sort of the late part of the century.
And so, Irina, can I interrupt real quick? This graph to the right shows how much carbon will end up in active layer, or like in the thaw.
Yeah, this is just like, I mean, we called it loss. I should like relabel that because it's like more like what becomes available to air.
Yeah, to warmer temperatures and possible decomposition.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, so it's sort of a possible stock.
Yeah, it's not in the atmosphere.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
I think what this triggered, and we know that these models are not quite right. We know that the databases are limited. We know that like this is not the final answer, right? But it does trigger. It triggered in our group a bit more thinking about like, okay, so like maybe we need to like, I'm interested in these like coasts and deltas and like how things get sequestered there. But maybe somebody also needs to think about the sort of the hill slopes and like how much change would be happening there. And like how important of a carbon stock is that? This is, we worked on this a little bit with a group of hackers, like in a week in May, with collaborators from the Los Alamos National Lab, a student from Penn State, and then some people from here, and are combining. So like we have the Q model, and then we combine it with a landscape, hill slope erosion model that comes from the land lab components. And so in the PyMT that I talked about earlier, you just import like these land lab components, and then you import the Q model, and then you can start combining these two together because they can talk to each other. And I mean, this is pretty initial work. Like we're like really like spent some days exploring this with the little group that we had. But what we're doing here is like, imagine this is a hill slope, and this is high, and this is low, and you're evolving it over time. And normally you would, this is depth-dependent diffusion for the landscape over long periods. But what we're doing here is we set depth dependency by saying how thick the active layer is. So like if you're at the frozen boundary, you cannot move the soil anymore. If you are in the active part of the soil profile, you could potentially move it. And so here's like after, I think, 100 time steps, the run, what it looks like if you have different active layer thicknesses with different elevations. So we're starting to play with basic concepts that come out of the permafrost models, and then basic like hill slope evolution models. And Joanne Marie is gonna pick this up a bit more over the summer. She's in Joel Rowland's group for the summer. So that's kind of where I think the power of the Permafrost Toolbox lies. Like there's a fairly easy way of combining things together and trying to play with things. I think that's kind of what this is. So it's an available tool. We're demonstrating it at the International Conference of Permafrost in China next year. We're trying to get some publications out so that people can kind of reference like what kind of theories behind these things, but it is already available on GitHub. And I mean, we're open and just grab it. It's even a download if you just want it. This project was mostly cyber infrastructure and was funded by NSF Cyber Infrastructure. The next step we're doing is to like make a bit more of a field observations and mechanism and advanced modeling tools with field observations too. So not stay only in the modeling domain, but make the two a bit more coupled again. But that's in the proposal phase. Thank you.
That's really cool. Thank you, Irina. I have a question.
Yeah.
You track how many people use it, download? Do you have any information on that?
We haven't been to, I mean, I only advertised it in EOS basically like a half a year ago or so. So I don't have a straight answer for you. We should. I think on GitHub, like when people are really actively making contributions and forking it and making like feeding code back, then we know.
Yes.
But when a person just downloads, I'm not sure that we keep track of that. So.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's just at some point it's useful to know maybe who is using it and how often or something. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I think in the end, I kind of know because people email me and they were like, I don't know, like at ABI, there was like someone Michael who works on seafloor permafrost. He was like, oh, I'd like to use it in a class. And there was somebody from Davidson College, and the same thing, you know, they were more interested in the teaching side of things. So I do know some people. And then with these hackathons, that's another place where I know that people used it and that it is working and that we found bugs. And that's
a useful thing about GitHub, right? People will help you fix it.
Yes, that's at least the ideal.
I know, yeah. Great, thank you. Does anyone have questions in the audience? Maybe not, or maybe you are muted and we cannot hear you.
So this isn't a question, Christina, but I did want to ask Irina if she would post just a really short description of the toolbox and the link to GitHub on the website. And then we can tag the people on your team, so it would get a pretty nice distribution that way as well.
Okay, yeah, that's a great idea.
I guess I have one question. So Irina, you're planning to just stay with for numerical model with this GIPL model, or there's some other ones as well? Of course, yeah. That's just I'm just kind of curious that if you want to consider some other models, including in this box, because you call it box, so it may be.
I mean, people are
like what say, for example, the Sebastian Westermeyer or some European scientists that they develop their own models, and of course it's much more complicated because it will be.
Well, I think GIPL and Sebastian's model are similar, right, in complexity.
Well, yeah, I think so. He has some,
Yeah. I mean, we were funded to do these three that we've done. Okay. So in that sense, I have not like a real plan of like, okay, now I still need to do this. Right.
And the question is why you need it. If you want to compare them or not, and you're going to different directions.
Right. It's not out of the question, because during the CSDMS meeting, there were two students who were both in Oslo, where Sebastian is as well. Mm-hmm. And they were sort of interacting with our group and like sharing what they're doing and what they're trying. There was also Jan Nietsbon from AVI, who has his own like more detailed what does he do? The little like polygons. So right. In principle, if people want to like contribute them and like put this in this toolbox and we can make them available, that would be great.
Maybe exactly something like this, because the question will be this. This model reflects mostly kind of long-term changes in the big, not abrupt thawing. So the question will sooner or later will be, will appear how you deal with abrupt thawing. So development of thermocars, and erosion and so on.
Right. I mean, Elchin was here for the hackathon, and he's been working with this advanced terrestrial simulator at Los Alamos National Lab, and like he was showing us results, and they're more like sophisticated in a way, because they do the full thermal physics and they do like account for the for like lateral transport of heat and fluids. But on the other hand, you can only use that for like a small transect or like a local place. So I think they're sort of, like there are different ways of asking questions, and some questions you can answer with the ones and other questions you can answer with the others. For now, what we're intending with this Permafrost Toolbox is to make connections to other domains. So like hill slopes, rivers. Anastasia is running it with, or it's like using a little delta code that she's been working on, and we could combine that with the Q model. So maybe they're more exploratory modeling.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Thanks.
Anyone else with a question or a suggestion or something? If
Hi.
not, yeah.
This is Elchin.
Hi,
Elchin.
Thank you, Irina. Really nice talk. I like Vladimir's idea. If we can use this project to have like this cyber infrastructure, modeling project for all permafrost models, that would be awesome. So people can just jump in and update their models.
You will be busy for the rest of your life.
Yeah, but for that we need to write another proposal.
Right.
So we need to figure out the funding source first.
I think I mean CSDMS is setting up a cryosphere group, and this might be one of the places where we could think about model intercomparison a bit more or whatever. But I think you're right, Elchin, that mostly these efforts happen once people have like some funding in hand and some goals in their heads of what they want to do, and then it happens. It's not like just for the sake of building something.